Husband leaves pregnant wife after Down syndrome diagnosis. 2 years later, he regrets everything. Welcome back, and enjoy the story. The ultrasound technician's face changed instantly. Her previously cheerful demeanor transformed into a mask of clinical detachment as she called for the doctor. In that moment, Franela knew something was wrong. At 42, this pregnancy had been unexpected, a miracle after years of believing she could never conceive. The doctor entered with a grim expression and delivered the news that would shatter Franela's world. Her baby would be born with Down syndrome. The harsh, fluorescent lights of the examination room seemed to dim around her as the doctor's words echoed in her mind. Franela's hands instinctively moved to her belly, cradling the small life growing inside her. A life that moments ago had represented pure joy, and now, according to the somber faces surrounding her, was somehow less than perfect. "There are options," the doctor said carefully, his voice distant and clinical. "Given your age and circumstances, many women in your position choose to terminate." Franela looked up sharply, her eyes clearing. "This is my baby," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "My child." The drive home was a blur of tears and racing thoughts. How would she tell? George, her husband of 15 years, had been reluctant about the pregnancy from the start, concerned about beginning parenthood in their 40s. Now, with this diagnosis, Franela feared his reaction. Their modest two-bedroom apartment in Chicago had always seemed cozy before, a perfect space for the two of them. Now, as Franela stood in the entryway, watching George's face transform as she delivered the news, the walls seemed to close in around her. "Down syndrome," George repeated, his voice hollow. "Are you sure?" "The doctor wants to do an amniocentesis to confirm, but the ultrasound showed clear markers," Franela explained, reaching for her husband's hand. He pulled away, rising from the couch to pace the small living room. "This isn't what we planned." Franela," he said, running his hands through his graying hair. "We're too old for this. We can't spend our retirement years caring for someone who will never be independent." "George, this is our child," Franela whispered, her hand returning to her belly, "a gift we never thought we'd receive." His expression hardened, and in that moment, Franela saw something she'd never witnessed in her husband's eyes before: coldness, calculation, and most devastating of all, rejection. That night, George slept on the couch. Franela lay awake, tears silently tracking down her face, her hand never leaving her belly. "We'll be okay," she whispered to her unborn child. "Whatever happens, we'll be okay." The next day, Franela returned from her shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse to find George packing his bags. The afternoon sunlight filtered through their bedroom window, illuminating the half-empty dresser drawers and the suitcase on their bed. "I didn't sign up for a lifetime of taking care of someone," he said coldly, before walking out the door, not even looking back at the woman who had shared his life for 15 years. Franela stood frozen in the doorway, the echo of the closing door reverberating through her bones. The apartment, once filled with the comfortable silence of long-term companionship, now roared with emptiness. She sank to the floor, her back against the wall, and allowed herself one moment of complete despair, one primal scream of anguish that no one was there to hear. Then, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, she rose. "It's just us now," she whispered to her unborn child. "But we're going to be fine." The next morning, Franela called her parents. At 75 and 77, they lived in a retirement community in Florida, their lives filled with bridge games and early bird specials. She had hoped for comfort, for the unconditional support parents are supposed to provide in times of crisis. "Oh, Franela," her mother sighed over the phone, her voice heavy with concern. "At your age and alone, perhaps it would be better to consider other options," she suggested delicately. The implication hung in the air between them, thousands of miles apart, yet unmistakably clear. "Mom, I'm keeping my baby," Frenella said firmly. "Well, you know your father and I can't help much. Our health isn't what it used to be, and we're on a fixed income now." The conversation ended with vague wishes of good luck and promises to call again soon. Frenella knew they wouldn't. She reached out to her closest friend, Martha, with whom she'd shared every major life event since college. The call went to voicemail. Hours later, a text message arrived. "So sorry to hear about everything. Swamped with work right now. Let's catch up when things settle down." Within a week, Frenella found herself completely alone, with only her unborn child for company. The abandonment stung like a physical wound, but with each passing day, a strange new strength began to take its place. A determination born of necessity, and a love that grew stronger as she felt the first fluttering movements inside her womb. If you are enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you. Continuing. Over the next 6 months, Frenella transformed her modest apartment into a sanctuary for her coming baby. The room that had once been George's home office became a nursery, painted in soft yellows and greens. Frenella worked extra shifts at the hospital where she was a nurse, saving every penny. The physical strain was immense, her feet swelling, her back aching as her pregnancy progressed. But she pushed through it all with grim determination. The other nurses whispered behind her back, their voices hushed but still audible in the quiet corners of the hospital corridors. At her age, and with Down syndrome, I couldn't do it. And the husband just walked out? What a mess. She's always been stubborn, never knows when to admit defeat. Frenella held her head high, focusing on her patients and the life growing inside her. She attended specialized prenatal classes and joined support groups for parents of children with Down syndrome, absorbing every piece of information she could find. The members of the support group became her first allies in this new life. There was Maria, whose son with Down syndrome had just graduated high school. Robert and David, whose adopted daughter with Down syndrome was a competitive swimmer. And Leanne, a single mother like Frenella, whose child was now 10 and thriving in a mainstream classroom with support. "The hardest part," Leanne told her over coffee one day, "isn't raising a child with Down syndrome. It's dealing with a world that isn't designed for them, and people who can't see past their own prejudices." Frenella nodded, understanding now that the challenge ahead wasn't just about navigating her child's needs, but also about fighting for a place in a world that was all too ready to push them aside. At night, alone in her apartment, Frenella read aloud to her unborn child books about animals, adventure stories, and poetry. She played Mozart and Bach, having read that classical music stimulated brain development. She talked constantly, describing her day, her hopes for their future, and her unwavering love. "You are wanted," she whispered each night before falling asleep. "You are loved. You are enough exactly as you are." As her due date approached, Frenella completed a birth plan with her doctor, specifying that she wanted immediate skin-to-skin contact after delivery, and that she intended to breastfeed. She researched early intervention programs and therapies that could help her child develop to their fullest potential. "You're very prepared," her obstetrician commented during a checkup, flipping through Frenella's meticulously organized binder of information. "I'm a nurse," Frenella replied simply, "and I'm this child's only advocate." When labor began, 3 weeks before her due date, Frenella called a rideshare to take her to the hospital. The driver, a kind-faced elderly man, noticed her grimaces of pain. "First baby?" he asked, meeting her eyes in the rearview mirror. "Yes," Frenella managed between controlled breaths. "Your husband meeting you there?" "It's just me," she said, and then, after a pause, added, "And soon, my daughter." The driver nodded thoughtfully. "The strongest people I know are single. Mothers," he said, accelerating through a yellow light, "and the luckiest children I know are those who are truly wanted." The labor was long and difficult. Franella's age and the baby's condition complicated the delivery. After 26 hours, the doctors began discussing a C-section. Exhausted, in pain, and afraid, Franella felt her resolve wavering for the first time since she'd received the diagnosis. "I can't do this," she whispered to the labor nurse, a young woman named Jade who had been with her through the night. Jade took her hand firmly. "Yes, you can. You're already doing it. Just a little longer now and you'll meet your baby." With a renewed surge of determination, Franella pushed for another hour. And then, at last, a cry pierced the air, strong, indignant, alive. "It's a girl," the doctor announced, placing the tiny, squirming infant on Franella's chest. When little Teresa was born with bright eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom in the world, Franella made a solemn promise to her daughter. "You will never be defined by what others think you cannot do." The hospital staff showed minimal enthusiasm, with one nurse even suggesting Franella temper her expectations for her daughter's future. But when Teresa wrapped her tiny hand around Franella's finger, nothing else mattered. The world narrowed. To this perfect moment, her daughter's warmth against her skin, the surprising strength of those tiny fingers, and the overwhelming love that flooded every cell of Franella's body. Teresa had the distinctive features associated with Down syndrome, almond-shaped. Eyes, a small nose, and a slightly protruding tongue, but to Franella she was simply breathtakingly beautiful. Her daughter's eyes, a deep, soulful brown, seemed to look directly into Franella's heart, recognizing her, choosing her. The hospital pediatrician came by the next morning, his manner professional but distant. He methodically listed potential: health concerns, heart defects, hearing problems, delayed development, while Franella held Teresa close, nodding to show she was listening but refusing to let fear overshadow these precious first days. "She'll need regular cardiac checkups, thyroid monitoring, and early intervention services as soon as possible," the doctor concluded. "The social worker will come by later to discuss resources available to families like yours." "Thank you," Franella said politely, "but I've already researched programs in our area. Teresa has her first cardiology appointment next week, and I've enrolled her in an early intervention program that begins at 1 month. The doctor looked up from his clipboard, seeing Franella clearly for the first time. "You're very well prepared." "I'm her mother," Franella replied simply. When they were finally discharged 3 days later, Franella stepped out of the hospital into the bright Chicago spring sunshine, Teresa securely bundled against her chest. The world looked different now, simultaneously more frightening and more beautiful than ever before. The apartment that had seemed so empty after George left now felt completely full with just Teresa's tiny presence. Franella settled into a rhythm of feedings, diaper changes, and stolen moments of sleep. The exhaustion was bone deep, unlike anything she'd experienced before, but it came with a strange exhilaration, a purpose that energized her even in the darkest hours of the night. Teresa proved to be a determined baby from the start. Breastfeeding, which can be more challenging for infants with Down syndrome due to low muscle tone, was difficult at first. Franella worked with a lactation consultant, and after weeks of struggle, Teresa latched properly, her tiny body relaxing into the newfound ease of nourishment. "She's a fighter," the lactation consultant observed, "just like her mom." The first months passed in a blur of small victories and constant learning. Franella documented everything meticulously. Teresa's first smile at 6 weeks, the way she tracked moving objects with her eyes, her strong startle reflex. Each milestone, however small, was celebrated as the achievement it was. But the weight of being everything to another human being, provider, protector, advocate, and nurturer, began to take its toll. Franella lost weight, her clothes hanging loosely on her frame. Dark circles became permanent fixtures under her eyes. Still, when she looked at Teresa, all she saw was the miracle of her existence, the privilege of being this remarkable child's mother. Franella's return to work 3 months later brought unprecedented challenges. The hospital administration, citing staffing needs, reassigned her to the night shift, claiming it was the only position available. The schedule meant that Franella would work from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., rush home to care for Teresa until the evening, catch a few hours of fitful sleep, and then begin the cycle again. "It's not ideal," her supervisor said with a shrug, "but we need flexibility from our staff, especially those with special circumstances." The words stung, but Franella nodded. She needed this job, the health insurance it provided, and the steady income. She found a night nurse, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patel, who had raised 6 children of her own and had a special affinity for babies. "She is special, this one," Mrs. Patel said on her first night, cradling Teresa with practiced ease. "She has old eyes, a wise soul." Exhausted from caring for Teresa during the day and working through the night, Franella still managed to take her daughter to every early intervention therapy session. The physical therapist, a young man named Carlos, worked with Teresa twice a week, helping strengthen her muscles and improve her coordination. "She's responding incredibly well," Carlos told Franella during one session, as Teresa determinedly batted at a dangling toy. "Her focus is exceptional for her age and condition." The speech therapist, an older woman named Dr. Reynolds, was similarly impressed. "Teresa's receptive language skills are developing beautifully," she noted during their 2nd month of therapy. "She's understanding and responding to verbal cues in a way that's quite advanced." At 6 months, Teresa could roll from her back to her stomach and was beginning to sit with support. She babbled constantly, making consonant sounds that Dr. Reynolds assured Franella were precursors to speech. She reached for toys, laughed when tickled, and had a particular fondness for the classical music Franella still played each evening. "She might have exceptional cognitive abilities despite her diagnosis," Dr. Reynolds suggested cautiously. "Every child with Down syndrome is an individual, with their own unique strengths and challenges. Teresa appears to have remarkable cognitive processing abilities." Franella absorbed this information with a mix of pride and caution. She had learned to celebrate Teresa's abilities without comparison, to measure success not against some arbitrary, normal standard, but against Teresa's own potential and happiness. The world still found ways to remind them of its prejudices. At a routine pediatrician visit, another mother pulled her toddler away when he approached Teresa's stroller with curious interest. At the grocery store, an elderly man stared openly, his expression a mixture of pity and discomfort. Each incident hardened Franella's resolve to create a world where her daughter would be valued for exactly who she was. One night, nearing the end of her shift at the hospital, Franella received an urgent call from Mrs. Patel. Teresa had a high fever and was unusually lethargic. Franella raced home, her heart pounding with fear. Children with Down syndrome have weaker immune systems, making common illnesses potentially more serious. Dr. Anderson, Teresa's pediatrician, met them at his office before regular hours. "Ear infection," he diagnosed after a thorough examination. "A bad one, but we caught it early." As Teresa received antibiotics and began to improve, Franella realized how precarious their situation was. If Mrs. Patel hadn't been experienced enough to recognize Teresa's symptoms as serious, if Dr. Anderson hadn't been willing to see them on short notice, if Franella herself hadn't been able to leave work immediately, any of these factors could have led to a much worse outcome. "We need more support," Franella admitted to herself that night, watching Teresa sleep peacefully in her crib, the fever finally broken. "I can't do this completely alone." Will the world ever see Teresa's true potential, or will she always be defined by her diagnosis? What will they do without a stronger support system? And how long can Franella sustain this exhausting pace alone? 6 months into motherhood, Franella received notice that her landlord was selling the building. With housing prices skyrocketing in their Chicago neighborhood and most landlords reluctant to rent to a single mother with a special needs child, Franella faced homelessness. She searched desperately for affordable apartments, but each application was rejected with vague excuses about waiting lists or other qualified applicants. The stress began to affect her work performance. One night, exhausted beyond measure, she nearly administered the wrong medication to a patient, a mistake that could have been catastrophic. The charge nurse, noticing Franella's shaking hands and unfocused eyes, pulled her aside. "You need help, Franella," she said firmly. "This isn't sustainable." In desperation, Franella approached her estranged mother-in-law, Harriet, a wealthy widow who had never approved of the marriage. The older woman lived in a sprawling Victorian home in an affluent Chicago suburb, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens and a life of privilege that had always made Franella uncomfortable. Their last interaction had been at Franella and George's wedding, where Harriet had made it clear that she found her son's choice of bride disappointing. "She'll never fit into our world," Franella had overheard her telling a relative. "She's from completely different stock." Now, standing on Harriet's doorstep with Teresa bundled against her chest, Franella swallowed her pride. The door opened to reveal Harriet, elegant as ever in a cashmere sweater set, her silver hair perfectly coiffed. Her eyes widened at the sight of Franella and the baby. "Please," Franella said simply, "we need help." To Franella's shock, the older woman invited them to stay in her guest house temporarily, though she refused to meet Teresa's eyes or acknowledge her directly. "George should never have abandoned his responsibilities," Harriet said stiffly, leading them around the main house to a charming carriage house at the back of the property, whatever the circumstances. The guest house was small but beautifully appointed, with a fully equipped kitchen, a comfortable bedroom, and a sunny living room. After months of stress and uncertainty, the space felt like a sanctuary. "Thank you," Franella said, her voice thick with emotion. "This means more than I can say." Harriet nodded curtly. "This arrangement is temporary," she emphasized, "just until you find something suitable." With that, she turned and walked back to the main house, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. The guest house became their home for the next 3 months. Franella continued working nights, with Mrs. Patel now staying in the guest house while Franella was at the hospital. During the days, Franella cared for Teresa and searched for permanent housing, though the search became less urgent now that they had a safe place to stay. Despite Harriet's initial coldness, Franella noticed small changes: baby supplies appearing on the porch, a pediatrician's bill mysteriously paid, a basket of fresh fruits and vegetables from the local farmer's market left by the door once a week. Franella made a point of sending Harriet photos of Teresa's progress, her first time sitting independently, her delight at discovering her reflection in a mirror, her intense concentration as she learned to transfer objects from one hand to the other. She never received a response, but the gifts continued to appear. Teresa thrived in their new environment. The guest house opened onto a garden where Franella would lay a blanket in the dappled shade of an old maple tree, allowing Teresa to experience the sensory richness of nature, the rustle of leaves, the feeling of grass against her skin, the sight of birds flitting between branches. One evening, Frenella returned from work to find Mrs. Patel sitting on the garden bench, an unusual expression of concern on her normally placid face. "Miss Harriet came today," she said, her voice low. "She came inside while Teresa was napping." Frenella felt a flash of alarm. What did she want? At first, she just stood in the doorway watching. Then Teresa woke up and saw her. She smiled, you know how she smiles, with her whole face lighting up. And Miss Harriet, she came closer. She asked if she could hold the baby. Frenella's heart raced. And I said yes. It seemed important somehow. Mrs. Patel's expression softened. Teresa went to her without hesitation, like she knew exactly who Miss Harriet was. And Miss Harriet, she started crying, just holding the baby and crying. That night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Frenella saw a light on in the main house. Acting on impulse, she walked across the garden and knocked softly on the back door. Harriet opened it, looking smaller somehow in a simple robe, her face bare of makeup, her silver hair loose around her shoulders. "I'm sorry if this is inappropriate," Frenella began. "But Mrs. Patel told me you visited today." Harriet nodded, stepping back to allow Frenella to enter the kitchen. A photo album lay open on the table, showing pictures of a young George with the same bright smile that Teresa now displayed. "She has his smile," Harriet whispered, tears streaming down her face. "The same exact smile." Frenella moved closer, placing a hand on the older woman's shoulder. "Would you like to meet her properly? She's asleep, but you could see her." Harriet nodded, and together they walked to the guest house. In the soft glow of the nightlight, Teresa slept peacefully, one small hand curled beside her face. Harriet stood over the crib, her expression transforming from grief to wonder. "She's perfect," she whispered. This marked the beginning of an unexpected alliance. Harriet began spending time with Teresa daily, reading to her, taking her for walks in an antique pram she had discovered in the attic, singing the same lullabies she had once sung to George. Teresa responded to her with the same open-hearted joy she showed to everyone who treated her with kindness. "She doesn't know. She's supposed to be limited," Harriet observed one day, watching Teresa determinedly push herself up on her arms, preparing to crawl. "No one has told her what she can't do." "And no one will," Frenella replied firmly. Harriet nodded thoughtfully. "George was wrong," she said finally, "about everything. We all make decisions that we later regret. But have you ever turned away from someone who needed you? What would it take for you to give them a second chance? Share a brief example in the comments." With her mother-in-law's support, Frenella enrolled in an advanced nursing program that would allow her to specialize in pediatric developmental disorders. The program was offered partly online, allowing her to continue working nights while studying during Teresa's nap times. It demanded even more of her limited time, but the knowledge she gained helped her better understand Teresa's needs and opened potential paths to a more stable financial future. Harriet, recognizing Frenella's determination, offered to watch Teresa 2 afternoons a week, so Frenella could attend in-person classes and study groups. What began as a practical arrangement evolved into precious bonding time between grandmother and granddaughter. "She said gamma today," Harriet announced proudly one evening when Frenella returned from class, "clear as day, looking right at me." "That's her third word," Frenella replied, her heart swelling with pride. "After mama and more." Meanwhile, Teresa defied everyone's expectations, reaching developmental milestones that doctors had warned might be impossible for her. By 9 months, she was crawling efficiently, pulling herself up on furniture and babbling with increasingly complex sounds. Her physical therapist was amazed by her core strength. Her occupational therapist praised her fine motor skills, and her speech therapist recorded her progress as exceptional. "Remember, all children develop at their own pace," Dr. Reynolds cautioned Frenella during one session. Teresa may plateau at some point. We need to celebrate every achievement without creating unrealistic expectations. Frenella nodded, understanding the well-meant warning, but in her heart she refused to place any limitations on what Teresa might accomplish. She had learned to walk the fine line between pushing her daughter to reach her full potential and accepting and celebrating exactly who she was at each moment. As Teresa approached her first birthday, Frenella and Harriet planned a small celebration in the garden. They invited Carlos and Dr. Reynolds, Mrs. Patel, and a few families from the Down syndrome support group. The day dawned bright and clear, the garden in full bloom, mirroring the joy that had blossomed in their once broken family. "I have something for you," Harriet said that morning, presenting Frenella with a small velvet box. Inside was a delicate silver locket on a chain. When opened, it contained a tiny photograph of Teresa on one side and George as a baby on the other. "Family is family," Harriet said simply, "no matter what." Frenella touched the locket, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, allowing Harriet to fasten it around her neck. The party was a testament to how far they had come. Teresa, dressed in a pale yellow dress that complemented her olive skin and dark curls, was the center of attention, clapping along to "Happy Birthday," smearing cake on her face with gleeful abandon, and charming every guest with her infectious laugh and bright eyes. As the last guests departed, Frenella and Harriet sat on the garden bench, watching Teresa play with her new toys on the blanket before them. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the maple leaves, casting dappled shadows that danced across the grass. "I've been thinking," Harriet said, her voice tentative. "The guest house is too small for both of you now that Teresa is becoming more mobile, and this house is far too large for just me." Frenella turned to her, surprised. "What are you suggesting?" "Move into the main house with me," Harriet said decisively. "There's more than enough space. Teresa could have the bedroom that was George's as a child. You could convert the study into your room. We could make this work." Before Frenella could respond, a shadow fell across the blanket. Looking up, she froze, her breath catching in her throat. George stood at the garden gate, his face leaner than she remembered, his eyes shadowed with what might have been regret. At Teresa's first birthday party, Frenella's husband unexpectedly appeared at the door. Having failed in his new relationship and business ventures, he claimed he wanted to reconnect with his family. Frenella felt her resolve wavering when he held Teresa with apparent affection. He moved back in, promising to support them emotionally and financially. For a brief period, Frenella believed they could be a complete family again. "George," Harriet gasped, rising from the bench. "What are you doing here?" He stepped forward hesitantly, his eyes fixed on Teresa, who was oblivious to the tension, happily stacking colorful blocks only to knock them down with a delighted giggle. "I heard about the party," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "From an old colleague at the hospital. I wanted to see her." Frenella stood, instinctively placing herself between George and Teresa. "You left," she said, her voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions inside her. "You didn't want her." George flinched, his eyes dropping to the ground. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I made the biggest mistake of my life." A tense silence fell over the garden, broken only by Teresa's happy babbling as she continued to play. Harriet remained frozen, her expression unreadable as she watched her son. "Maybe we should talk inside," Frenella finally suggested, nodding toward Teresa. "This isn't a conversation for little ears, even if she doesn't understand yet." In Harriet's formal living room, with its antique furniture and family portraits spanning generations, George told his story. After leaving Frenella, he had moved to Boston with a colleague, a younger doctor who had pursued him for months. The relationship had quickly soured in the harsh reality of daily life together. "She wanted the idea of me, not the actual person," George admitted, "and I was not in a good place." His medical practice had suffered as well. Distracted and depressed, he had made a minor but concerning error with a patient's medication. The resulting investigation had led to a temporary suspension of his privileges at the prestigious hospital where he worked. "I've been doing locum tenens work in rural clinics," he explained, "moving from place to place, trying to, I don't know, outrun what I did. But I couldn't stop thinking about you, about the baby, about the family I threw away." Franella studied the man she had once loved beyond reason, the father of her child, now a stranger with familiar eyes. She saw genuine pain in his face, real regret in the slump of his shoulders, but she also saw the weakness that had allowed him to abandon them when they needed him most. "Teresa," she corrected gently. "Her name is Teresa. She's not the baby. She's your daughter and she's incredible." George nodded, swallowing hard. "Teresa," he repeated, the name awkward on his tongue. "I'd like to know her, if you'll let me." Harriet, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "You abandoned your child," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Your own, a flesh and blood. How do we know you won't do it again when things get difficult?" George turned to his mother, visibly shocked by her protective stance toward Franella and Teresa. "Mom, Don't mom me," Harriet interrupted. "You need to understand something. Franella has done what you couldn't. She's been everything to that child while working full-time, studying to advance her career, and dealing with a world that constantly underestimates Teresa. She's the strongest person I've ever known." Franella felt a rush of emotion at Harriet's words. This unexpected defense from a woman who had once been coldly dismissive of her. "I want to make amends," George said quietly. "I want to be part of Teresa's life, and yours, Franella, if that's even remotely possible." Franella considered his words carefully. She had imagined this moment countless times during sleepless nights. George, returning, begging forgiveness, wanting to reclaim his place in their lives. In her fantasies, she had alternated between triumphant rejection and tearful reunion. The reality was more complex, suffused with a melancholy understanding of just how much had changed. "Teresa deserves to know her father," she said finally. "But this needs to happen slowly, on her terms and mine. You left once. You don't get to disrupt her life now based on what you want." George nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Anything," he agreed, "however you want to handle this." They established a careful routine. George would visit twice a week for short periods, always with Franella present. He would follow Teresa's lead, engaging with her on her terms, learning her preferences, her schedule, her unique ways of communicating. To Franella's surprise, Teresa took to him almost immediately. She had always been an unusually perceptive child, quick to assess adults and decide whether they were worthy of her attention. With George, she was open and curious, offering him toys and babbling enthusiastically, as if telling him stories about all he had missed. "She has no idea," Franella remarked to Harriet one evening after George had left. "No concept that he abandoned her before she was born." "Children forgive," Harriet replied thoughtfully. "It's what makes them wiser than us, in some ways." Over the next few weeks, George became a regular presence in their lives. He joined them for weekly therapy sessions, taking careful notes on Teresa's progress and the exercises they were meant to practice at home. He researched Down syndrome extensively, reading medical journals and joining online parent forums to better understand Teresa's needs and potential. One rainy afternoon, while Teresa napped, George approached Franella with a proposal. "I've been offered a position at Northwestern Memorial," he said, referring to one of Chicago's most prestigious hospitals. "Head of a new integrative medicine department. The salary is substantial." Franella nodded, unsure where he was going with this information. "I'd like to set up a trust for Teresa," he continued, "for her education, therapy, whatever she needs throughout her life. And I want to contribute to your school expenses too. That's generous, Franella acknowledged cautiously. It's not generosity, George corrected her. It's responsibility. It's the bare minimum of what I should have been doing all along. The trust was established, with both Franella and Harriet as trustees, to ensure the funds would always be used. In Teresa's best interests, George also began contributing to household expenses, relieving some of the financial pressure that had been a constant in Franella's life. One evening, after a particularly good day, where Teresa had taken her first tentative, supported steps between the coffee table and the couch, George lingered after Harriet had gone upstairs to bed. "I miss you," he said simply, his voice low and intimate in the quiet living room. "I miss us." Franella felt a flutter of her old feelings for him, a nostalgia for the partnership they had once shared. George had been her best friend before he was her husband, her confidant, her supporter through nursing school, and the early years of her career. But the memory of his abandonment remained sharp and clear. "I appreciate that," she said carefully, "but so much has changed, George. I've changed. My priorities, my understanding of love and commitment, they're different now." He nodded, accepting her words with a resignation that spoke of his own growth. "I understand. I'm just grateful to be in Teresa's life, and yours, in whatever capacity you'll allow." For the next 2 months, they settled into a tentative co-parenting relationship. George joined them for dinner 3 nights a week, attended Teresa's therapy sessions, and occasionally watched her while Franella attended classes. Harriet observed this careful dance with cautious optimism, her relationship with her son slowly healing through their shared love for Teresa. The illusion shattered one evening when Franella, looking for a medical journal article she'd printed for a class assignment, entered George's car to retrieve her bag. A notification flashed on his phone, which was connected to the car's Bluetooth system. Curious, Franella picked it up and found herself staring at a banking app notification showing a large withdrawal from an account labeled T Education Fund. With a growing sense of dread, Franella checked the recent transactions. Over the past month, George had made multiple withdrawals from the trust fund, supposedly established for Teresa's future needs. In total, nearly half the money was gone. Her hands shaking, Franella continued to investigate. In his email, she found correspondence with a former colleague about a sure-thing investment opportunity in an experimental medical device company. Another email thread revealed substantial gambling debts to an offshore sports betting site. The house of cards collapsed completely when she discovered a hidden folder of screenshots. One showed a dating app profile he'd recently updated. Another revealed a flight confirmation for a trip to the Cayman Islands scheduled for the following week, a trip he had mentioned to neither Franella nor Harriet. Heart racing, Franella gathered the evidence and returned to the house. George was in the living room, Teresa on his lap as he read her a bedtime story, the picture of devoted fatherhood. "I need to speak with you," Franella said, her voice steady, despite the turmoil inside. "Alone." Harriet, sensing the tension, took Teresa upstairs for her bath. When they were alone, Franella placed George's phone on the coffee table between them. "I found this in your car," she said simply. "You've been stealing from Teresa's trust fund." George's face drained of color. "I can explain," he began, his voice taking on the same persuasive tone he had once used with difficult patients. "It's a temporary reallocation. The investment opportunity is guaranteed to triple the returns within 6 months. Teresa will have more money in the end. And the gambling debts, the dating profile, the secret vacation?" Franella's voice remained calm, though her hands had curled into fists at her sides. "Were those for Teresa's benefit too?" His composure cracked. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under," he hissed, suddenly hostile. "Playing the doting, Father to a defective child pretending this is the life I wanted. The moment the cruel words left his mouth, George seemed to realize he had revealed his true self. He attempted to backpedal, reaching for Franella's hand. I didn't mean that. You know I care about Teresa. Franella stepped back, suddenly seeing with perfect clarity the man before her. Not the husband she had once loved, but a selfish, manipulative stranger whose return had been calculated, motivated by financial desperation rather than genuine remorse. Get out, she said quietly. Now. You're overreacting, George insisted, his voice rising. This is still my mother's house. You can't throw me out. As if summoned by his words, Harriet appeared in the doorway, Teresa in her arms. The little girl, sensing the discord, was unusually quiet, her eyes wide as she looked between her parents. What's happening? Harriet asked, though her tone suggested she already knew something was terribly wrong. When Franella explained what she had discovered, showing Harriet the evidence on George's phone, the older woman's face hardened with a resolve Franella had never seen before. You stole from your own child? Harriet's voice was deadly quiet. You lied to us, manipulated us, all while planning your escape. George turned to his mother, his expression shifting to one of calculated charm. Mom, you know how these things can be misinterpreted. I was only— Stop! Harriet cut him off. I don't want to hear any more lies. She turned to Franella. Call the police. Mom! George protested, his voice rising with panic. You can't be serious. Teresa, frightened by the raised voices, began to cry, her small body trembling in Harriet's arms. The sound seemed to snap something in George, who lunged toward them, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and anger. Give me my passport and wallet, he demanded. I'm leaving. This whole situation was a mistake from the beginning. Franella stepped between George and Harriet, her protective instinct overriding any fear. You're not taking anything else from this family. With trembling hands but a steady voice, Franella called the authorities, while Harriet took Teresa to her room, away from the escalating tension. When confronted with the evidence of his financial misconduct, George became verbally abusive, causing Teresa to become inconsolable with fear. Harriet's arrival during the confrontation led to her immediately calling the authorities. With trembling hands but a steady voice, Franella filed a restraining order against the man she had once loved. The aftermath of George's second betrayal left a heavy silence in the house. Teresa, sensitive to the emotional undercurrents, became clingy and anxious, waking with nightmares and regressing slightly in her developmental progress. Franella took a week off from work and school, dedicating herself entirely to reassuring her daughter that she was safe, loved, and would never be abandoned again. Harriet, devastated by her son's actions, but resolute in her support of Franella and Teresa, became their fiercest protector. She hired a lawyer to recover the stolen funds and restructure the trust with ironclad protections against future exploitation. She also formally invited Franella and Teresa to make the main house their permanent home. Family isn't always who we're born to, Harriet told Franella one evening as they sat together after Teresa had finally fallen asleep. Sometimes it's who we choose, who stays when others leave, who sees our value when others are blind to it. This betrayal led to an unlikely partnership between Franella and her mother-in-law. Together, they created a detailed development plan for Teresa, combining traditional education with innovative therapies. The older woman used her connections to introduce Franella to leading specialists in developmental pediatrics. During this collaboration, Franella noticed her mother-in-law's persistent cough and insisted she see a doctor. The diagnosis was concerning, a serious respiratory condition requiring immediate treatment. Dr. Blackwell, a respiratory specialist at Northwestern, delivered the news with gentle directness. It's chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, he explained, showing them the shadows on Harriet's lung scans. Quite advanced, I'm afraid. We need to start aggressive treatment immediately. The irony wasn't lost on either woman. Just as they had found each other, just as they had formed a family of choice in the aftermath of abandonment, they faced another potential loss. But the crisis only strengthened their bond. I'm not going anywhere yet, Harriet declared stubbornly after her first round of treatment. I have a granddaughter to raise and a daughter to support through her final year of school. Her reference to Frenella as her daughter brought tears to both their eyes. The family they had created might be unconventional, formed through shared trauma and resilience rather than blood ties, but it was real, and it was theirs. As her mother-in-law underwent treatment, Frenella balanced her studies, work, and caring for both Teresa and the older woman. The community that had once judged her began to take notice of her unwavering dedication. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now offered to pick up groceries or medications when they went to the store. Colleagues at the hospital volunteered to swap shifts when Harriet had treatment appointments. The mothers from Teresa's support group organized a meal train, ensuring that fresh, home-cooked food appeared on their doorstep 3 times a week. A local journalist, Sarah Jennings, heard about their story through a mutual acquaintance at the hospital and approached Frenella about writing a feature for the Chicago Tribune's Sunday magazine. People need to hear stories like yours, Sarah explained during their initial meeting. Not just the challenges of raising a child with Down syndrome, but the unexpected beauty that can emerge from what society often sees as tragedy. Frenella was hesitant at first. Their lives felt both intensely private and precariously public. Teresa's visibility as a child with Down syndrome already drew stares and unsolicited comments when they ventured out. But Harriet encouraged her to consider the opportunity. Think of all the expectant parents receiving a Down syndrome diagnosis right now, she said. Think of how your story might change the conversation for them. The article, when published, was sensitive and powerful. Sarah chronicled Frenella's journey from abandonment to empowerment, highlighting Teresa's achievements without sugarcoating the very real challenges of raising a child with special needs. She portrayed Harriet's transformation, from distant mother-in-law to devoted grandmother, and the unlikely family they had created together. The response was overwhelming. Emails flooded Sarah's inbox from parents of children with various disabilities, from medical professionals seeking to improve their approach to delivering diagnoses, and from ordinary readers moved by the story of resilience and unconditional love. One of those readers was Dr. Eleanor Chen, a renowned pediatric specialist who had pioneered an experimental developmental program for children with genetic disorders. The program combined traditional therapies with cutting-edge neurofeedback techniques, music therapy, and specialized physical training. Your daughter's progress is remarkable, Dr. Chen told Frenella when she called, having tracked down her number through Sarah with permission. I believe she would be an excellent candidate for our program. We have a grant-funded spot available immediately. The catch? The program was based at Boston Children's Hospital, requiring them to travel for intensive 2-week sessions every 3 months. Harriet, still recovering from her latest round of treatment but determined as ever, waved away Frenella's concerns about the logistics. We'll make it work, she said firmly. This is Teresa's chance to show the world what she can do. What will it take for Teresa to truly thrive in a world that places limits on her potential? And how will Frenella navigate the new opportunities opening up while caring for both her daughter and her ailing mother-in-law? Sophia flourished in the program, developing speech and motor skills that astonished the specialists. Frenella documented her daughter's progress meticulously, creating a comprehensive case study that became the foundation of her final project for her advanced degree. Her research on tailored intervention approaches for children with Down syndrome gained recognition in professional circles. Each trip to Boston became a family adventure. Harriet, despite her health challenges, insisted on accompanying them, her presence a steadying force as Teresa navigated new environments and experiences. The trio would explore the city between therapy sessions, visiting the New England Aquarium, where Teresa became entranced by the undulating jellyfish, or the Boston Common, where she delighted in chasing pigeons across the wide lawns. Dr. Chen and her team were consistently impressed by Teresa's progress. By 18 months, she was speaking in 2-word combinations, her fine motor skills allowing her to turn pages in books and use a spoon with increasing precision. Her cognitive assessments placed her ahead of the expected curve for children with Down syndrome, though still behind neurotypical peers of the same age. The combination of early intervention, consistent therapy, and, I cannot emphasize this enough, a loving, stimulating home environment has created optimal conditions for Teresa's development, Dr. Chen explained during one assessment review. She's demonstrating what's possible when we reject artificial limitations and focus on individual potential. Back in Chicago, Franella's final semester of advanced nursing studies coincided with Harriet's most aggressive round of treatment yet. The older woman's health deteriorated noticeably, her once erect posture now stooped, her breathing labored even with supplemental oxygen. Still, she insisted on maintaining as much normalcy as possible, sitting with Teresa each morning for their ritual of reading books and practicing new words. "Gamma sick," Teresa observed one day, patting Harriet's hand with unusual gentleness for a toddler. "Yes, darling," Harriet admitted, gathering the little girl into a careful embrace. "But Gamma is still here." The moment crystallized something for Franella. The precious impermanence of their time together, the legacy Harriet was creating through her relationship with Teresa, and the urgency of capturing these connections before they were lost. She began recording video diaries of their interactions, preserving Harriet's stories, her wisdom, and the unique bond she shared with her granddaughter. As graduation approached, Franella compiled her research on Teresa's development into a comprehensive thesis on personalized intervention approaches for children with Down syndrome. The paper incorporated not only clinical data from Teresa's participation in Dr. Chen's program, but also qualitative observations of the role family support played in her progress. Her advisor, Dr. Martinez, was impressed. "This goes beyond academic research," she told Franella after reviewing the final draft. "It's a roadmap for families and clinicians alike. Have you considered publishing?" 15 months after Teresa's birth, Franella graduated with honors. At the ceremony, she was stunned to see many familiar faces in attendance. Former colleagues who had once whispered behind her back, neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact, even her parents who had doubted her ability to raise Teresa successfully. Her mother-in-law, now recovered, and Teresa's devoted grandmother sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Franella's parents approached hesitantly after the ceremony, their expressions a complex mixture of pride and lingering uncertainty. "We were wrong," her father admitted, his voice gruff with emotion. "About you, about Teresa. We should have been there for you. We'd like to be part of your lives now," her mother added, "if you'll let us." Now Franella looked at her daughter, who was currently charming the Dean of Nursing with her bright smile and enthusiastic high fives. "Teresa makes her own decisions about who belongs in her life," she said, not unkindly. "You're welcome to get to know her, but you'll have to earn her trust, just like anyone else." The graduation celebration continued at Harriet's home, now officially Franella and Teresa's home as well. The garden had been transformed with fairy lights and colorful streamers, Teresa's favorite music playing softly in the background. Friends new and old, mingled on the lawn, united by their connection to this remarkable little family. Dr. Chen, who had flown in specially for the occasion, pulled Franella aside during the festivities. "I've been talking with the hospital board about a new initiative," she said, her expression animated with excitement. "A family-centered approach to developmental disorders, focusing on education and support from the moment of diagnosis. We need someone to head up the Chicago branch, someone with both clinical expertise and lived experience." The offer was unexpected but perfect, a chance to transform her personal journey into professional purpose, to support other families. Finding their way through the complex terrain she had navigated largely alone. That same week, Northwestern Memorial Hospital, where Franella had worked throughout her pregnancy and Teresa's early months, approached her with a similar proposition. They were establishing a new department focused on supporting families of children with developmental differences, and they wanted Franella to develop and lead it. "Your experience as both a medical professional and a parent gives you a unique perspective," the chief of medicine explained. "And your work with Teresa has demonstrated what's possible when families receive proper support and education." The ESAO hospital where Franella worked offered her a position developing a new department focused on supporting families of children with developmental differences. Her first initiative was creating a mentor program pairing experienced parents with those who had just received a diagnosis. The program quickly expanded to neighboring hospitals, with Franella frequently invited to speak about her experiences and expertise. "This isn't just about Teresa anymore," Franella told Harriet as they discussed the hospital's offer. "It's about changing the conversation around disability, about giving families the support I wish I'd had from the beginning." Harriet, who had been steadily improving under a new treatment protocol, nodded thoughtfully. "You've found your calling," she observed, "and in the most unexpected way." Franella accepted the position at Northwestern, where she would work 3 days a week developing programs while continuing Teresa's involvement in Dr. Chen's research. The schedule was demanding but sustainable, allowing Franella to remain actively involved in her daughter's daily care and development. Her first initiative was creating a mentor program, pairing experienced parents with those who had just received a diagnosis. She remembered all too vividly the isolation of those early days, the fear and uncertainty that had threatened to overwhelm her before she found her own network of support. "We'll be there from day one," she explained to her team of volunteer mentors, many of whom were parents she had met through Teresa's support groups. "No family should leave the doctor's office with a diagnosis and nothing else. They need to see that there's a future, a community, a path forward that includes joy and achievement alongside the challenges." The program launched with a modest cohort of 10 mentor families, each specially trained to provide emotional support, practical information, and connection to resources. Within months, the impact was evident in the feedback from newly diagnosed families who reported less anxiety, greater confidence, and a more positive outlook on their children's futures. Word spread. Neighboring hospitals began inquiring about implementing similar programs. Franella found herself invited to speak at medical conferences, parent advocacy events, and hospital grand rounds. Her message was consistent and powerful. Disability does not diminish humanity, and with the right support, children with developmental differences can lead rich, meaningful lives that enrich the communities around them. As Teresa approached her second birthday, she spoke in complete sentences, defying all predictions about her verbal development. The little girl who had been rejected by so many had become the center of a growing community of support. Franella's apartment, now a warm and vibrant home purchased with help from her mother-in-law, became a gathering place for families seeking hope and guidance. Teresa's second birthday party was a celebration not just of her life, but of the transformation. she had inspired in so many others. The garden overflowed with friends, fellow parents from support groups, therapists who had become extended family, colleagues from the hospital program, and even some of the families who had been supported through Franella's mentor initiative. 2! Teresa announced proudly when asked how old she was, holding up 2 fingers with perfect clarity. Teresa, 2 today! Harriet, looking healthier than she had in months, watched her granddaughter with undisguised adoration. She knows exactly who she is, she remarked to Franella. No doubts, no limitations, just pure Teresa. Later that evening, as the last guests departed and Teresa slept soundly upstairs, exhausted from the excitement, Franella received an unexpected call from an educational foundation that had heard about her work through Dr. Chen. They were impressed by her advocacy and research and offered her a substantial grant to expand her program nationally. On Sophia's 2nd birthday, Franella received an unexpected call from an educational foundation impressed by her advocacy work and research. They offered her a substantial grant to expand her program nationally. Standing in her kitchen, watching Sophia play with her grandmother, Franella realized that what had once seemed like the end of her dreams had actually been the beginning of something far more meaningful. The path had been unimaginably difficult, but Sophia's smile, bright and unconditional, made every struggle worthwhile. In fighting for her daughter, Franella had discovered her own purpose and strength, proving that a mother's love can indeed change the world, one small victory at a time. Standing in her kitchen, watching Teresa play with her grandmother, Franella realized that what had once seemed like the end of her dreams had actually been the beginning of something far more meaningful. The path had been unimaginably difficult, but Teresa's smile, bright and unconditional, made every struggle worthwhile. In fighting for her daughter, Franella had discovered her own purpose and strength, proving that a mother's love can indeed change the world, one small victory at a time. The Foundation's grant would allow her to bring her program to hospitals across the country, training mentor parents and healthcare providers to support families from the moment of diagnosis through the early years of intervention. It was an opportunity to transform her personal experience into systemic change, to ensure that no parent would face the isolation and fear that had characterized her early days with Teresa. As Franella considered the offer, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from the devastating moment in the ultrasound room, through abandonment and struggle, to the unexpected alliance with Harriet and the creation of a new kind of family. Each challenge had forged her into someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate than she had ever imagined becoming. Teresa, with her bright eyes and indomitable spirit, had been her teacher throughout, showing her the power of determination, the beauty of difference, and the immeasurable value of unconditional love. This child, whom so many had seen as a burden, had become Franella's greatest gift, opening doors to purpose and connection that might otherwise have remained undiscovered. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Harriet asked, joining Franella at the kitchen window, where they could watch Teresa arranging her new toys with meticulous care. "How different our lives would be if we'd listened to everyone else," Franella replied softly. "If I'd terminated the pregnancy, if you'd turned us away from your door, if we'd accepted the limitations others tried to place on Teresa." Harriet slipped an arm around Franella's waist, the gesture now familiar and comforting. "We're stubborn women," she said with a smile, "too stubborn to let fear make our decisions for us." "I'm going to accept the Foundation's offer," Franella decided aloud, "but with conditions. I want to develop a branch focused specifically on grandparent education and support. So many extended families withdraw just when they're needed most, because they don't know how to help or what to expect." "A brilliant addition," Harriet approved. "I was certainly clueless at the beginning." "You figured it out pretty quickly," Franella said, squeezing the older woman's hand. Together they watched as Teresa moved on from her toys to the bookshelf, carefully selecting a colorful picture book and bringing it to them with a hopeful expression. "Read, please," she requested, her pronunciation clear, her manners impeccable. Teresa and Mama and Gamma read together. As they settled onto the couch, Teresa between them with the book open on her lap, Franella felt a profound sense of rightness, of coming home after a long and arduous journey. Here, in this moment of ordinary domestic peace, was the extraordinary reward for refusing to give up, for believing in possibilities when others saw only problems. Once upon a time, Franella began reading, her voice steady and sure. There was a very special girl who changed everyone around her. Teresa looked up with a delighted smile, recognizing her own story in these words. "Like Teresa," she exclaimed. "Exactly like Teresa," Harriet agreed, meeting Franella's eyes over their granddaughter's head. "The most special girl in the world." In that moment, surrounded by the family she had fought so hard to create and protect, Franella knew with absolute certainty that every struggle had been worthwhile, every tear she'd had watered the garden where this unexpected joy now bloomed. What others had seen as tragedy had become her greatest triumph, not despite the challenges, but because of them, because she had refused to surrender to fear or conform to limited expectations. Teresa's future would hold its own challenges. Of course, the world was still learning how to make space for difference, how to recognize the unique contributions of people like her daughter. But Franella was no longer afraid. Together with Harriet and the community they had built around them, they would continue to advocate, educate, and celebrate Teresa exactly as she was, complete, worthy, and infinitely precious. As the evening light faded into dusk, and Teresa's eyes began to grow heavy with sleep, Franella made a silent vow to continue sharing their story, to be a light for others finding their way through similar darkness, and to never stop challenging the artificial limitations society placed on people, like her daughter. For in Teresa's smile, in her determination and joy, was all the evidence needed that love, stubborn, unconditional, fierce love, could indeed change the world, one small victory at a time. Congratulations. Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.